Hey YouTube, Warble's on a lot here. ABC Radio National is going to tell us a story about Konfrontasi, the secret shooting war that happened between Australia and Indonesia 30 years ago.
Part of our focus on histories of our near neighbours, we're reopening the dossier on Australia's secret war with Indonesia. You might recall the spying row which erupted between Australia and our biggest neighbour Indonesia back in November, including the tapping of the Indonesian president's phone. Well, as we'll hear in our program today, there's a history to this tension. In 1965 and 66, Australian troops fought a covert war inside Indonesian territory in Borneo. In fact, this information was kept so secret that only a handful of cabinet ministers knew of the military actions. The soldiers themselves were under strict instructions not to tell anyone, not even their wives. In 2007, when this documentary was first broadcast on Hindsight, it was the first time that the soldiers' stories were told in public. Konfrontasi, Our Secret War, is produced by Tom Morton.
Cross-border operations was something that was not talked about at all, and indeed it was a very closely guarded secret at the time.
It was top secret for 30 years. From 1966 to 1996 was top secret.
Before we went across, it was clearly told to me that our trip across the border was to be totally unattributable. And that meant that we virtually carried no marked maps at all. We carried no paperwork. If we carried a notebook that had nothing in them, they were blank.
We had no trepidation about it at all. We knew we were going to go over. We wanted to go over.
There was an Indonesian sentry sitting on a raised seat, just like a tennis umpire, armed with what to me looked like a 5-inch caliber submachine gun, and he was staring straight at me.
The only possible trepidation that we had was that we couldn't expect helicopter support or artillery support or even water support, so we knew when we were over there that we were on our own.
The biggest risk that we had was the fact that we couldn't get any wounded out. We'd have to carry them out.
The soldiers weren't allowed to carry any letters or any means of identification other than the dog tags they wore around their neck. And indeed, I think the only thing that we left across the border was our footprints.
Rod Curtis, who was awarded the Military Cross for his service in Borneo. If you'd asked the average Australian in the early 1960s what they thought was the most dangerous challenge that we faced in our region, they'd almost certainly have said it was the confrontation between Indonesia and Malaysia and the possibility that Australia could be dragged into an open war with our nearest neighbour.
This is the front line of Indonesian confrontation, the border between Sabah and Sarawak and Indonesian Borneo. Commonwealth Army units are in the jungle seeking out guerrillas.
In the past few months, more than 250 Indonesian regular troops have been landed or airdropped into southern Malaya.
Australia is committed. Tim Bowden continues.
Australian troops are deeply involved in the defence of Malaysian Borneo. In fact, another battalion is due to arrive later this year. If the already weakened Malaysia cannot hold together, the Australian government will be placed in a very awkward predicament.
The big question here now is, will the new year bring bigger landings over a wider area? The answer to this question could well decide the difference between confrontation and war in 1965.
Confrontation was both a public and a highly secret war. At the height of the conflict, Indonesia launched paratroop raids on the Malaysian mainland. Australian troops were sent to Borneo to repel incursions by Indonesian guerrillas. At least that was the official story. Unofficially, our troops were themselves carrying out ambushes and patrols well inside Indonesian territory. These operations, codenamed Claret, were masterminded by the British Military Command.
The British called it a policy of moral attrition, to try and grind down the Indonesians, increase tensions within the country, to try and defeat the guerrillas on the border, on their side of the border, and therefore force Indonesia back down.
And there were times when the British were talking air attacks and using Darwin as a base for substantial air attacks on Indonesia, flying their V-bombers, which were capable of carrying nuclear bombs, flying them over Indonesia to frighten the Indonesians. And Australia was worried that this could escalate, quite out of control.
Yet even at the most perilous moments in confrontation, war was never actually declared. Australia maintained diplomatic relations with Indonesia even while soldiers from both sides were shooting at each other in the jungles of Borneo. The true nature of confrontation was one of the most closely guarded secrets in Australian history, both at the highest levels in Canberra and on the ground in Borneo. David Thompson was commander of the 4th Royal Australian Regiment in Borneo in 1966.
Cloud operations were never discussed outwardly, and within the companies, if a patrol came back, they didn't tell the rest of the company what they were doing.
My company, Charlie Company, was in a forward operating base at Boca in Sarawak, and that was about 10 kilometres from the border region, and it was forward of Bow, where the battalion headquarters was located.
And we tried and dressed the troops we used. We had to wait a couple of weeks while we were tested before we were allowed to go to the border.
In that forward operation base, there were 3 platoon commanders of the company. I commanded 9 platoon, Max Chambers commanded 7 platoon, and Doug Byers commanded 8 platoon. Now, they both had done cloud operations, over the border operations, and I wasn't aware of that. I wasn't aware of the fact that both of those platoon commanders and their platoons had been across the border. And it's just remarkable that I hadn't got a hint of it.
Even your own wife didn't know, and you were the commanding officer.
And my wife didn't know, and none of the other wives. If they did know, they never talked to the other wives. Because if one wife had spoken about it, it would have gone round the wives' net very quickly. And the diggers were wonderful, even after a few drinks. They obviously didn't talk to their wives about it.
Well, one thing that I've been really curious about, do you know where the name Claret came from?
I think someone must be having a glass one night and decided that was a good name to call it.
October 1964, Jakarta, Indonesia. Armed Forces Day. The anniversary of the day in 1945 in which the People's Security Army was formed. After the first wave of successful revolution and the state of Indonesia was proclaimed, this army became the national army.
So why did we fight a secret war with Indonesia? And why was the story of that war kept under wraps for 30 years? It's almost impossible to imagine now just how volatile our region was in the early 1960s. Indonesia was barely 20 years old. Malaysia was a newborn nation. The long shadows of Dutch and British colonialism were slowly fading, but in their place, new rivalries were emerging, fueled by nationalism and the global competition of the Cold War. It was all part of the process of the British decolonisation of their interests in this part of the world. There was at this time Malaya, Singapore was separate, and so were the British territories on the island of Borneo, Sabah, Sarawak and Brunei. And the thought was that they would be stronger if they were united under the title of Malaysia. Sukarno, President Sukarno in Indonesia, at first didn't seem to react too strongly to this, but then he started regarding it as an example of what he called necolem, neo-colonialism and imperialism. He portrayed the view that this was basically the British hanging on to their interests in a disguised form and intruding on an island where most of which was part of Indonesia, known to them, of course, as Kalimantan.
Ganyang Malaysia, or Crush Malaysia, has become a national rejoinder throughout Indonesia. Along Jakarta's streets, on hoardings that greet you almost at every turn, is the sign of aggression, the sign of force and provocation.
Sukarno objected to the inclusion of Sabah and Sarawak into Malaysia, and he declared, or his foreign minister, Dr. Subandrio, declared that their policy was one of konfrontasi, confrontation, which left it open as to whether it was going to be diplomatic or military or a bit of both.
The song of Nazicom, the state ideology, which says, "Let's show our fists together, be united our strength. Let's go forward, Nazicom united. Remove the pig-headed. Nazicom's one ideal, socialism will triumph."
Sukarno was not himself a communist. He was a radical nationalist, but he was balancing three major sort of elements in Indonesian domestic politics. There was the rising Communist Party, the PKI, which was getting closer and closer to the Chinese Communist Party. There was a nationalist strand, and there was also the elements of an Islamist stand, as we would now say. And confrontation was a very useful device by which he could keep the communists and the army, who were anti-communists but strongly nationalists, on the same side.
That's Peter Edwards, who's the author of Crises and Commitments, the official history of Australia's involvement in Southeast Asian conflicts. President Sukarno had already taken on and defeated one colonial power, the Dutch, and now he would have to face another.
Britain at this time got very alarmed. The British got very alarmed at what Sukarno was doing, and they tended to portray the threat from Sukarno in the most alarmist terms. They explicitly compared him with Hitler at times and said that if the Western world backed down, if Sukarno took over what is now East Malaysia, he'd then move on and take over the Malayan Peninsula, he'd take over all of New Guinea, he'd move into Melanesia and so forth.
The British were trying to maintain themselves as a global power, global military power. They created Malaysia as a way to decolonise, but also to gain access to the Singapore military base. And the Singapore base is very important in Britain's role as a power in the Far East. It is an important military base. For example, they planned to use bombers there to atom bomb China in case of a war. And the British saw confrontation by Sukarno, by Indonesia, as a way to try and drive them out of Singapore, tried to break up Malaysia, but also force the British out of the military base in Singapore.
David Easter. Hanging on to Singapore may have been Britain's ultimate aim during confrontation, but the real theatre of war was Borneo. British authorities wanted to stop Indonesian troops linking up with what they believed was a strong covert communist organisation in Malaysian Borneo.
This is the front line of Indonesian confrontation, the border between Sabah and Sarawak and Indonesian Borneo. Commonwealth Army units are in the jungle seeking out guerrillas. It is a difficult country. The native Dayak people are politically unaware. For them, the 1,000-mile border is meaningless. Not so politically unaware are the Chinese. 8,000 were placed behind barbed wire following a raid on a Kuching police station. A secret Chinese communist group was blamed.
The British and Malaysian authorities in Malaysia were very concerned about the dissident Chinese communist elements in Borneo itself. From all my reading and research in the records, it has to be said, I think, that those concerns, whilst real, never actually seem to have amounted to very much. The Chinese Communist Organization had been pretty effectively dealt with during the emergency in the 1950s, and it doesn't seem to have played a very large or active role at any stage in the fighting in Borneo.
Geoffrey Gray, who's Professor of Military History at the Australian Defence Force Academy.
Where the Indonesians did have some advantages was much more with the Aboriginal people, the Iban and Dayak, whose traditional lands, of course, were divided by the stroke of a pen on a map, which meant absolutely nothing to them, and who, in some parts of Borneo, were, in fact, reasonably pro the Indonesians for personal and familial reasons. I remember talking to one Indonesian colonel who had been operating in Borneo in 1964-65, and he was actually married to a local Iban woman.
Our mission was to protect the local people, but also to prevent the Indonesian penetration into the interior of Sarawak, into the populated areas where they could mingle with the locals and carry out subversive activities, sabotage. The idea was to prevent them getting into the settled areas and doing any damage, and also harassing the tribal people. So it was a protection role along the border.
So that was the official side of the mission. There was, of course, another side of the mission which was unofficial and indeed kept top secret. Tell us about that.
Yes, well, the British senior officers that were running the campaign decided quite early that the way to stop the Indonesians coming across the border was to do preemptive raids and try and ambush them in Indonesia as they came over. And that proved to be quite successful. It kept the Indonesians off balance. There was a limit on how far we could go. The limit was 7,000 metres inside Indonesian territory. The Special Air Service, I think the limit for them was a little bit further. Those crossings were designed to find information on what the Indonesians were doing and then try to prevent them taking the initiative and get them off balance.
Brian Avery. Avery was a lieutenant with the 4th Royal Australian Regiment in Borneo. He's published a history of their operations there called Our Secret War. Avery led 10 platoon across the border into Indonesian territory on what was codenamed Operation Thunderball.
Basically, it was a patrol whose main aim was to locate an Indonesian position that had previously been undetected. So my job was to find out exactly where it was, do a close reconnaissance, find out what the Indonesians were doing there, you know, how many of them, what they were doing. And having done that, I was then to move upstream from this camp and put surveillance along one of the rivers. There are no roads in the Indonesian side, and they used to use the rivers as their highways. And some of the successful ambushes took place on these rivers.
To get to the border to begin the operations, we had to climb up a mountain called the Gunung Raya, which was basically a razorback ridge which defined the border between West Malaysia and the Indonesian side. And it used to take us about 3 to 4 hours sometimes to get up the top. Sometimes we had to crawl up, especially if it rained. It was terrible. And in most places it was pure jungle with trees 20 foot thick and 50, 60, 70 feet high. Very humid, very close, and very physically exhausting.
Alan Price was an infantry corporal at the time, and he too went across the border on claret operations.
We had to move through large inland freshwater swamps, mangrove swamps. And that was very difficult going because the water varied between sort of ankle deep up to waist deep and very slow and very exhausting for fully laden troops. And we got stuck in it at night, and I thought at one stage I'd probably have to put our hammocks up in trees and sleep over the water.
So you go out for your 7 days or 14 days, come back in for 2 or 3 days, get everything prepared again. But in the meantime, your feet were that waterlogged. You invariably had tinea, you had heat rash under your arms, on your chest, on your back, around your backside. And when we did come back from a patrol, we wouldn't wash our clothes, we just burned them.
Now, the Indonesian position was not very far away from a Dayak village. That was the people who'd been doing the slash and burn agriculture. And we could actually hear the children and the roosters and the dogs and that in the village. So it was essential to keep our presence secret.
When you went up to do reconnaissance of the Indonesian position, you very nearly got spotted, didn't you?
Yes, the SAS patrol had reported that the Indonesian position was surrounded by a pig fence. And I stumbled upon this pig fence and we went to ground to observe the position, and I became alarmingly aware that there was an Indonesian sentry sitting on a raised seat, just like a tennis umpire, armed with what to me looked like a 5-inch caliber submachine gun. And he was staring straight at me, but he didn't see me. There were 4 of us in the reconnaissance patrol. I'd left the platoon in its base, and we stayed there for the whole day and kept the position under observation, just lying in the undergrowth close to this pig fence. And at one stage, an Indonesian soldier came out of one of their bunkers and walked over to the pig fence and commenced to urinate over the fence. almost on top of one of my soldiers who was lying observing.
It was tough for them. Close air support would not be given except in extreme emergency.
Here endeth part 1.